There are seasons in a man's life where the loudest sound in the world is the silence of the people who were supposed to stand by you. Welcome back to the bank and the barn. Sometimes it feels like the dirt under your boots is the only thing holding you up, and even that is mortgaged to the hilt. When Arthur Pendelton found himself staring down a crushing deadline, his blood relatives looked the other way. Have you ever been abandoned by family during your hardest hour? Let me know in the comments below, because this story proves that sometimes grace comes from the place you least expect it. Arthur was 90 days away from auction. The family had surrendered. The bank had the deed. And what happened next in that loan officer's cubicle changes the way we think about debt, legacy, and who your real family is. The Pendelton operation sat on 400 acres of hard-pan soil in western Kansas. It wasn't a postcard farm. It was a working, bleeding, grinding wheat and sorghum operation that had chewed through 3 generations of Pendelton men. Arthur was 42, his hands permanently stained with grease, his shoulders carrying the posture of a man who spent his life looking down at broken implement parts. He had grown up here with 2 older brothers and a younger sister. The house used to echo with arguments, slamming screen doors, and their mother's quiet humming. But distance has a way of erasing history. When Arthur's father passed away 5 years ago, he left behind a fractured estate. The siblings inherited equal shares of the land's value, but the land itself, and the crushing operational debt, was left entirely on Arthur's shoulders. He was the only one who stayed. His brother Mark moved to Dallas to sell commercial real estate. His brother David went to Chicago. His sister Sarah married a dentist in Omaha. They wanted their equity, but they didn't want the dirt. To pay them out, Arthur had to leverage the farm's remaining equity to the absolute limit. He bought their silence, but he mortgaged his future to do it. The margins were razor thin before the drought hit. When the rain stopped in mid-June, the sorghum stunt. The stalks turned a brittle yellow, rattling in the Kansas wind like dry bones. Arthur was running a 1980s-era combine that required more mechanic work than field tim. He was sleeping 4 hours a night, waking up in a cold sweat thinking about the diesel bill at the local co. The balloon payment on the inheritance buyout loan was due on November 1st. It was a staggering $68,000. Arthur had mapped it out on a yellow legal pad 100 times. If the harvest was strong, he'd barely make it. But the drought burned the yield by 40%. The math was no longer difficult. It was impossible. He started skipping meals to save the grocery money for parts. He stopped running the heater in the farmhouse, wrapping himself in his father's old wool coat just to look at the ledge. The silence of the empty house pressed against his ribs. He was drowning, and he was completely aloe. Arthur wasn't a man who wore his faith on his sleeve. His prayers weren't loud, and they weren't polished. One Tuesday night, after spending 6 hours trying to weld a cracked header on the combine in the freezing barn, the torch ran out of gas. Arthur dropped his mask, leaned his head against the cold iron of the machine, and closed his eyes. He didn't ask for money. He didn't ask for rain. He just asked for the strength to not become bitter. He walked back to the house, his boots crunching on the frozen GRA. On the kitchen table, underneath a stack of past-due notices, sat his mother's old Bible. It was splitting at the spine, the pages soft like cloth. Arthur didn't open it, but he rested his grease-stained hand on the cover. "Just show me the next step, Lord," he whispered to the empty room. "I don't know how to carry this by myself in him." The institution holding the note was First Liberty Agricultural, a regional bank situated in a brick building 2 towns over. His loan officer was a man named Gregory Finch. Finch wasn't a villain. He was a pragmatist. He wore a gray suit, looked at spreadsheets, and measured a man's worth by his debt-to-asset ratio. In early October, Arthur sat in Finch's office. The air smelled like stale coffee and floor wax. Finch slid a manila folder across the desk. The numbers were printed in stark black ink. "Arthur," Finch said quietly, tapping the paper, "the collateral doesn't cover the gap anymore. The acreage value dropped, and your yield projection is critically low. If we don't see the balloon payment by the 1st, the board will initiate the foreclosure protocol." "It's not personal. It's compliance." Arthur stared at the folder. He knew the mechanics of rural death. First, the auctioneer signs go up. Then, the neighbors stop making eye contact at the hardware store. Finally, the tractors are loaded onto flatbeds, and a corporate outfit buys the dirt for pennies on the dollar. That evening, Arthur swallowed the last ounce of his pride. He sat in his father's old recliner, picked up the landline, and called his older brother, Mark, in Dallas. He didn't ask for a handout. He asked for a bridge loan, just enough to cover the interest and restructure the balloon payment to keep the family name on the mailbox. The silence on the line was heavier than the silence in the farmhouse. Finally, Mark sighed. It was the tired, impatient sigh of a man dealing with a nuisance. "Artie," Mark said, his voice clipped, "we told you not to take on the buyout. You forced this. I've got a mortgage, I got private school tuition, I got my own problems. Sell the equipment, let the bank take the acreage, and go get a regular job. It's just dirt. Let it go." His sister Sarah told him roughly the same thing the next day, hiding her refusal behind her husband's financial boundaries. They had the money. They just didn't care about the farm. The fracture was complete. They hadn't just left the land. They had left him. The sting of rejection burned, but it clarified everything. Arthur realized that preserving the family legacy was a ghost story he was telling himself. The family was gone. There was only the land and the work and his own 2 hands. Over the next 3 weeks, Arthur worked like a man possessed. He couldn't make the bank payment, but he refused to let the farm die in a state of disrepair. He sold his only reliable pickup truck to a neighbor just to buy the diesel needed to finish the harvest. He drove a rusty 4-wheeler into town for groceries. He worked through the freezing nights, bringing in the meager sorghum crop, storing it meticulously, prepping the winter wheat beds as if he would be there to see it sprout. A neighboring farmer, noticing Arthur walking miles in the cold, dropped a cord of firewood on his porch without a word. It was a tiny gesture, but it kept Arthur tethered to humanity. He was preparing the farm for its next owner. He was making peace with the end. The morning of November 1st was gray and bit. Arthur put on his only suit, the one he had worn to his father's funeral. He gathered the farm ledger, the keys to the farmhouse, and the titles to the aging equipment. He drove to First Liberty Agricultural in the neighbor's borrowed truck. He was walking in to surrender the keys before the sheriff had to come out and take T.H.M. He sat in the lobby for 20 minutes. Finally, Gregory Finch called him back, but instead of the cubicle. Finch led him into a glass-walled conference room. Inside sat 3 older men, the local loan committee. Arthur placed his keys on the mahogany table. "I don't have the 68, Arthur said softly. "I brought the deeds. I just ask that you give me 30 days to move my things OU." The men looked at each other. Finch pushed a new stack of papers across the table. "Pick up your keys, Arthur," Finch said. "We aren't taking the farm." Arthur froze. One of the board members, an old guy with calloused hands who used a farm near the county line, leaned forward. "Arthur, we reviewed your fill. We saw the buyout structure you took on to pay off your siblings. We also know you sold your own truck just to finish the harvest, and you prepped the winter field for a farm you thought you were losing. Your family gave up on this land, but we invest in operators, not absentees." Finch tapped the paper. We utilized a federal rural preservation grant to write down the toxic interest rate of your inherited debt. We bought out the original note. We're stretching the principal over 30 years at a fixed 2%. Your balloon payment is canceled. Your new monthly payment is a third of what it was. Arthur couldn't breathe. He stared at the paperwork, the numbers swimming in his vis. The bank hadn't performed magic. They had recognized a man doing the impossible alone, and they used their institutional power to shield him rather than crush him. They absorbed the risk because his character was undeniable. When Arthur signed the papers, his hand sh. Okay. He drove back to the farm as the sun was breaking through the gray November clue. He parked the borrowed truck, walked out into the middle of the harvested field, and fell to his knees in the dirt. The family was still go. There would be no holiday dinners, no joyous reunions with his brothers. But as he ran his hands through the freezing Kansas soil, he realized he wasn't carrying their ghosts anymore. The farm was his. The land was S.A. Faye. The quiet surrender he had offered to the Lord weeks ago in the barn had been answered, not with a lottery ticket, but with grace from the men in gray suit. It's a hard truth, but sometimes the people who share your blood aren't the ones who will stand in the trenches with you. Arthur's story reminds us that grit, integrity, and a quiet faith rarely go completely unnoticed. Eventually, the right people see the work you're doing in the dark. What would you have done if your own siblings abandoned you to carry the family BU? Would you have walked away, or would you have fought until the absolute end? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments. If this story meant something to you, please subscribe to The Bank and the Barn and share this video with someone who might be fighting a quiet battle of their own. Until next time, keep your faith steady and keep your hands to the plow.